I remember the rain first. Not the case, not the man, not the final dreadful symmetry of it all. Just the rain, threading its way down the old stones with the kind of patience one usually reserves for monks or sinners. It had been falling since late afternoon, a thin, almost apologetic drizzle that blurred the lamps along Merton Lane and softened the sharp outlines of the Tower gate. I stood there longer than I should have, listening to the small taps against the puddles, thinking of a crossword clue that had refused to surrender its secret all morning. 5 letters. Something about an unanswered call. It irritated me more than it should have, though irritation was, even then, a form of comfort. Lewis had asked if I wanted to head back early. I told him I preferred the walk, though the truth, as is usually the case, was more private. Something in the porter's tone earlier had stayed with me, a faint unease tucked behind his habitual courtesy. He had stopped me on my way past the lodge with a hesitant "Sir, I wonder if I might mention something." There had been a knock at the Tower gate late the previous night, well past closing. Not a drunken student or a lost couple from Christchurch Meadow, but someone alone, someone who knocked once, waited, and then vanished before the porter could reach the door. He told me this with the air of a man reporting a dream he could not quite justify remembering. I'd smiled at him then, out of habit rather than conviction, and offered some quiet reassurance that people often lost their bearings after dark. Yet the detail nagged at me now as I walked. A single knock, no second attempt, no footsteps afterwards, just the sound swallowed by the night. There was a rhythm to it the porter had tried unsuccessfully to reproduce, as though afraid he would forget it, a rhythm that had stayed with him, and now, I realized, with me. The air smelled of wet paper, the particular scent of Oxford in November, when the libraries breathed out their dampness and the colleges seemed to fold further into their centuries. I found myself looking at the Tower gate the way one might look at an old photograph, half expecting it to reveal some movement it had never shown before. The lantern above the arch flickered in the wind, an unsteady little pulse. I wondered if the man, if indeed it had been a man, had stood there long enough to be illuminated by it, or if he had remained a shadow, unregistered by anything except that single knock. A small deduction presented itself then, nothing grand, just a quiet observation. The porter had said he heard the knock clearly from inside the lodge, yet the lodge door had been nearly shut at the time. Sound does not travel so generously through wood unless the listener is already alert, already expecting it. So why had the porter been awake, hovering near the threshold at that hour? He claimed it was a coincidence. I suspected otherwise. People rarely admit their reasons for waiting, especially when they themselves do not understand them. I walked on, tracing the curve of the lane toward the garden, letting the rain cling to my coat like a persistent question. The stones beneath my feet were slick, reflecting the lamps in wavering pieces. Somewhere, a bicycle bell rang in the distance, thin as a note plucked from a failing violin. Oxford at night possesses a peculiar loneliness, the kind that does not reveal itself until one stops trying to outrun it. I have known that loneliness, often enough, it has become something like an acquaintance one nods to in passing. A woman hurried under a dark umbrella, her face haunted by the glow of her phone. She did not look up. People rarely do near Merton Tower. It has the habit of making one feel watched, though by what I have never been certain. The old stones hold too many stories, and stories have a way of pressing themselves into the living whether one invites them or not. I paused again beneath the arch and ran my hand along the cold iron of the gate. For a moment, the drizzle softened into mist, settling around me like a thin veil. I closed my eyes and imagined the solitary figure standing here the night before the hesitation, the brief lift of the hand, the quiet knock. No urgency, no panic, just a message delivered to a place that could not answer it. Later, I would come to understand that the whole investigation, every contradiction, every lie, every grief-soaked revelation was already contained in that first detail. But standing there in the rain, I knew only that someone had knocked on a closed gate, and the silence that followed had been louder than the sound itself. It was Lewis who told me the news the next morning, though he did it with the reluctant air of a man interrupting another's solitude. I'd been standing under the stone archway near the meadow building, watching the early light spread itself thinly across the quad, when I heard his steps behind me. "There's something you ought to see, sir," he said, and I could tell from the quiet weight in his voice that whatever waited for us was not something he wished to describe twice. I followed him across the grass, the damp cold creeping up my sleeves, the smell of wet leaves clinging to the air like a hesitant confession. The body lay near the edge of the path, half sheltered by the low wall, as though the man had attempted to sit down and failed to negotiate the final inch. A constable stood nearby with a notebook pressed awkwardly to his chest, as if embarrassed by the formality of it all. The dead man's hair had been brushed by the wind into soft, disordered strands, giving him the appearance of someone who had merely paused to think and forgotten to rise again. There was no sign of a struggle, no bruising, no theatrical arrangement of limbs, nothing to invite a dramatic interpretation, just stillness, unadorned. Lewis said the preliminary guess was suicide. Pills, perhaps. A quiet end. I nodded because that was the expected response, though even then a faint disquiet curled beneath the surface of my thoughts. Suicide often announces itself with a certain logic, a pattern one can trace back through the person's life debts, illnesses, loneliness, a final note folded too neatly. But this man carried none of that. Instead, tucked inside his coat, the constable had found a library slip dated years before either Lewis or I had joined the force. December 1974. Returned late. A name written in thin, slanted ink that meant nothing to any of us. I crouched beside the body, the cold seeping into my knees, and studied the slip more closely. The ink had faded, but not evenly. Someone had traced over part of it, though only once, and only lightly, as if unsure of the purpose. I felt Lewis watching me, waiting for a comment. I told him it was curious. He nodded, though curiosity did not warm him the way it warmed me. His concerns were more practical, more grounded in the present. Mine, unfortunately, tended to wander. We stood in silence for a while. The meadow building loomed behind us, its windows still unlit at that early hour, each pane holding a dim reflection of the river beyond. The place had always held a particular stillness for me, a quiet that felt almost medicinal. Yet now the quiet seemed to recoil, as though the presence of the dead man had shifted something in the air. There was a faint smell of wet stone and cold earth, the kind that lingers after a long night of rain. I realized suddenly that his shoes were hardly damp. If he had walked far, the soles should have been soaked. That small deduction stayed with me longer than it should have. A dry sole on a rain-heavy morning can mean a great deal or nothing at all, but in my experience, it seldom means nothing. I asked the constable where he had been found precisely. The man gestured to the spot with an awkward firmness, insisting that the body had not been moved. I did not contradict him, though doubt nudged at the edges of the claim. People often misremember distances when fear stiffens their posture. Lewis asked if I recognized the name on the library slip. I told him I did not. But something about the year 1974 scratched against a memory I could not quite summon. A case unsolved? A missing student? A scandal muttered about behind senior common room doors? Oxford has a way of burying its past beneath layers of polite silence, and sometimes the silence holds more truth than the archives. As we prepared to leave, I glanced back at the meadow building. A curtain lifted briefly on the second floor, then fell again, too quickly to be accidental. Someone was awake. Someone was watching. And though the morning light was beginning to brighten the path, the impression of that unseen gaze shadowed the air like a faint, uninvited draught. I felt then quietly, without certainty that the knock at Merton Tower and the body by the Meadow building were not two unrelated notes, but the opening chords of the same unfinished composition. But the shape of it, whatever it was, remained stubbornly out of reach, like a clue misplaced inside a crossword grid whose solution refused, for now, to reveal itself. There is a particular silence that clings to Oxford colleges in the middle hours of the morning, a silence that feels less like an absence of sound and more like the lingering breath of all those who once passed through the quads. As I walked through the narrow passage leading toward the senior common room, I felt that silence gathered around me, not hostile, merely observant. The rain of the previous night had left a thin sheen on the flagstones, turning each step into a muted echo that seemed to belong to someone else. I found myself thinking of the dead man again, of the odd stillness of his face, and of the date written on that old library slip. A small, stubborn question had begun to take root in my mind, though I did not yet know where it would lead. Lewis had spoken briefly with a few tutors before I arrived, and he gave me a quick summary as we crossed the quad together. They remembered nothing unusual, he said. No late-night visitors, no arguments carried through thin walls, no sightings of a stranger wandering the college grounds. It was the sort of information meant to reassure, though it rarely did. Oxford dons have a long history of forgetting precisely what might be useful. The first man we met was Professor Eldridge, a retiring classicist whose hair fell over his forehead in soft grey strands that reminded me faintly of our victim. He greeted us with an air of mild inconvenience, then invited us into his rooms with a gesture that suggested we were expected to appreciate the gesture more than he did. His shelves were crowded with books in Latin and Greek, their spines worn to the color of old ivory. He spoke with practiced detachment about the discovery of the body, insisting that the college had no connection whatsoever to the man. As he spoke, he paced in small, precise steps, as though measuring out the conversation. I asked whether he had heard anything unusual the previous night. He paused, fingers brushing the edge of his spectacles, and said only that storms often produced strange acoustics around the tower. He said it in a way that made me wonder whether he was repeating something he had told himself long before we arrived. Then, almost as an afterthought, he quoted a line of Tennyson, though he attributed it to Browning. A small slip, perhaps, but slips often reveal more than truths. When we left his rooms, the corridors felt colder, as though the air had thinned. A cleaning woman passed us without lifting her eyes from the floor. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked shut, the sound elongated by the length of the hallway. Next, we met the college librarian, a neat, sharp-featured man named Coleridge, no relation, he assured us with a smile too quick to be entirely natural. He handled the mention of the library slip with a deliberate calm, stating that old materials were frequently misplaced or misdated. As he spoke, he tapped a finger lightly against the edge of the desk, the rhythm a little too steady. When I asked who had borrowed the book most recently, he hesitated just long enough for me to wonder whether he was searching for the truth or the most convenient version of it. Lewis noticed the hesitation as well, though he remained tactfully silent. I thanked Coleridge and told him we might return with more questions. His eyes flickered with something unreadable, not fear, not guilt exactly, but a faint tightening of thought. A man considering possibilities. As we stepped back into the main corridor, a figure moved at the far end. A visiting researcher, Lewis whispered, though he knew no more than the name the porter had given him earlier. The man walked with a kind of restless purpose, his head slightly bowed, as though listening to some internal argument he could not quite resolve. He did not look our way, but his steps quickened when he passed the Meadow building staircase. A subtle avoidance, perhaps unintentionally revealing. The morning had turned brighter, but the quad still held a muted chill. I paused near the cloister and listened to the faint hum of a lecture beginning somewhere beyond the stone walls. Students laughed, a sound too young and too light for the weight I felt pressing through the case. I thought again of the date on that slip, 1974, and the nagging sense that the year mattered. Something mislaid in the archives of memory. As we left the college grounds, Lewis asked what I had made of the tutors. I told him that everyone we had spoken to had been truthful in such a way that left me uneasy. Too careful, too measured, too precise in what they did not remember. Oxford often prefers its ghosts quiet, but ghosts rarely oblige. And somewhere behind those tidy half-truths, I felt the faint stir of a story trying to find its voice. I've always believed that the smallest errors are the ones that cling longest to the mind, like faint smudges on a lens that refuse to be wiped away. It was that misquoted line offered so casually by Eldridge the previous morning that returned to me as Lewis and I walked through the dim passage toward the college archives. Browning had never written it. Tennyson had. A trivial mistake for most, but not for a classicist nearing retirement, a man whose identity had been built upon the precision of ancient words. I did not yet know why it bothered me, only that it hovered at the edge of some larger, unspoken pattern. The archive room greeted us with its familiar mixture of dust and cool stillness, a smell I had always found both melancholy and faintly comforting. Papers breathe differently here. They exhale the past in long, slow sighs, as though reluctant to be disturbed. Lewis flicked on the lamp near the reading table, and the yellow glow revealed rows of boxes stacked with the indifference of centuries. A college assistant had left a manuscript for us to examine something the dead man had consulted during his last days, or so we were told. I opened the folder carefully, feeling the brittle resistance of the aging paper. The manuscript was little more than a sheaf of annotated poems, some copied, some original. It was the sort of work produced by scholars who prefer quiet to recognition, men who live half their existence in margins. One poem in particular caught my eye, an unfinished stanza written in a shaky hand, the ink darker than the rest. A line had been crossed out, then rewritten, though the erasure was incomplete. Beneath the corrected version, a faint ghost of the original words still lingered. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, muttering something about indecipherable handwriting. I told him handwriting was often less important than intention. That earned me a look, one part amusement, one part weary indulgence. I ignored it, tracing my finger gently along the page. A small tear ran down the right edge where a sheet had once been removed. But removed by whom and why? I lifted the corner and examined the fibers. They had not been torn recently. The absence was older, its purpose unclear. A deduction whispered faintly then, as deductions often do before they are ready to show their full shape. The poem was incomplete, not because it had never been finished, but because its conclusion had been taken away. Words withheld are sometimes more dangerous than those written. As I studied the ink, the misquoted poet resurfaced in my mind with renewed insistence. If Eldridge had been careless in attribution, was the carelessness deliberate? A man quoting the wrong poet may simply be tired. A man quoting the wrong poet when speaking of a body found on his doorstep may be something else entirely. Perhaps he had wished to draw attention away from the line itself, or perhaps he had wanted us to notice the error. I could not tell. Oxford minds delight in ambiguity. It keeps them safe. Lewis wandered toward a shelf of catalogues, flipping through them with the controlled impatience of a man who prefers facts to fragments. He asked whether the manuscript had any connection to the library, slip dated 1974. I told him I didn't know. But something in the looping script of the annotations tugged at a memory. A case involving a forgotten thesis, a tutor who vanished abroad with more debts than friends, a student whose name had appeared briefly in the newspapers before fading into the anonymity of adulthood. None of it was clear, but the feeling of distant familiarity pressed gently against the edges of my thoughts. A floorboard creaked in the hallway outside. The sound was soft, almost hesitant, like someone pausing before committing to a step. Lewis turned, but by the time he reached the door, the corridor was as empty as a dismissed prayer. The archives have that effect. They swallow footsteps with the same ease they swallow secrets. I, Cardini, looked again at the missing page. The absence felt pointed rather than accidental. Words had once lived there, words someone had decided should no longer be read. Whether those words had belonged to the dead man or to a poet he admired, I couldn't yet say. But as I closed the manuscript, I felt the faint stir of an idea beginning to form, as though a line half erased in the dark had started to reappear under the light. In Oxford, truth rarely announces itself. It emerges gradually, like ink rising through old paper, slowly, reluctantly, and shaped as much by what has been removed as by what remains. I had not intended to linger in the cloisters that afternoon, but the college has a way of arranging one's steps according to its own quiet logic. The rain had eased into a thin mist, soft enough to obscure the edges of the stone arches, yet sharp enough to leave a chill on the fingertips. I remember hearing the faint drip of water from the guttering above, each drop landing with a patience that mirrored my own uncertainty. The manuscript from the archives still weighed on my mind, the missing page, the hesitant ink, the sense of something half-remembered and half-hidden. It all pressed gently at the back of my thoughts, like a forgotten line from a poem one almost recalls. Lewis had gone ahead to speak with the college secretary, leaving me to wander the cloister alone. It was there, in the quiet stretch between two shadowed alcoves, that I first saw her. She stood with her back to me, her coat unbuttoned despite the cold, her posture composed yet touched by a faint tremor, the kind that suggests a mind occupied by something heavier than the weather. She did not turn when my footsteps approached. Instead, she spoke in a low voice that carried just enough to reach me, as though she had known I would stop beside her. "You're here about the man they found by the Meadow building." She said it not as a question, but as a quiet recognition, the way one acknowledges a truth one has already lived with for some time. I told her I was. She nodded once, a small, deliberate movement, and kept her gaze fixed on the far end of the cloister where the archway opened toward the quad. "There are always men like him," she continued, "men who return to places that have already taken something from them. They imagine they can reclaim it, revise it, rewrite it. But time rarely allows such things." Her voice was steady, almost meditative, though there was a subtle resonance beneath it, something unresolved, something carried too long. I asked if she had known him. She hesitated, not visibly, but in the slight pause between breaths, a pause so brief one could easily mistake it for a moment of reflection rather than restraint. "Only in passing," she said. Yet her tone betrayed a faint contradiction, a soft tightening at the edges that suggested the truth was larger than the portion she had chosen to offer. The mist drifted slowly through the open archway, curling around, her shoes like an encroaching memory. I noticed then that she held a folded paper in one hand, not deliberately concealed, but not displayed either. It was worn at the edges, creased as though handled often. A letter, perhaps, or a page removed from something older. My eyes lingered too long, and she noticed. She closed her fingers around the paper with a quiet finality. "It's nothing," she said, "but nothing rarely comes folded into quarters." I told her the college librarian had mentioned recent interest in an old volume from the 1970s. Her expression shifted, barely perceptible, a small narrowing of the eyes as if the year had touched a nerve she'd hoped lay dormant. She looked away then, toward the opposite wall where the stone was stained darker from years of damp. "People forget how long a place can remember," she murmured. "Longer than any of us. Sometimes longer than our lives." Her phrasing lingered with me. Not their lives. A small slip of pronoun, almost as telling as Eldridge's misquoted poet. I filed the details away, the way I sometimes tuck a difficult crossword clue into my pocket, until its answer reveals itself in some unexpected moment. She asked whether I believed the man had taken his own life. I replied that I wasn't sure. She nodded as if she had expected nothing else. There was something almost serene about her composure, but not the serenity of peace, more the kind acquired by someone who has built careful walls over many years. Lewis called to me from across the quad then, his voice carrying a faint urgency. She stepped back into the shadow of the archway, the mist gathering around her like a curtain drawing closed. Before she faded into the darker corridor beyond, she said something I didn't fully understand at the time. Some returns are not chosen. Some are demanded. I watched her disappear into the half-light, wondering which kind of return had brought her here. When I turned to leave, the faintest smell of old paper drifted past me as though she had been standing near an open archive box moments before, or as though she had taken something from one. I have always distrusted solutions that arrive too quickly, yet there are moments in an investigation when an idea settles itself into one's mind with such smooth inevitability that it feels almost impolite to question it. That afternoon, as Lewis and I walked across the damp quad toward the senior common room, I felt the faint, treacherous comfort of a theory forming with deceptive clarity. It gathered itself from fragments of Eldridge's misquoted poet, the librarian's hesitation, the missing manuscript page, the woman in the cloister shadows fragments that seemed, for a brief and dangerous hour, to align into a neat design that flattered my need for coherence. The rain had finally stopped, though the sky held its grayness with the stubbornness of a man refusing to apologize. We reached Eldridge's staircase, its wooden steps worn into shallow curves by decades of hesitant feet. Inside, his rooms were lit by a single lamp, its glow warming only the small radius of the desk where he had arranged his books with the precision of someone measuring out his remaining days. He greeted us with the same weary civility as before, though I noticed his fingers twitch slightly when I mentioned the manuscript. That twitch became the first thread I pulled. I told him, gently, that the dead man appeared to have taken an interest in the same forgotten volume he himself had once worked on, a volume tied obscurely but unmistakably to a younger scholar whose ambitions had collided with Eldridge's own in the mid-1970s. Lewis shifted beside me, registering the tension though not yet understanding its shape. Eldridge's eyes narrowed. Not in anger, but in the stunned focus of someone watching old ghosts step forward without permission. He murmured something about academic disagreements, long resolved, but the tremor in his voice struck me as too tightly held, too conscious. I pressed lightly the missing page, the altered poem, the erased name. I asked whether he had ever regretted the way that particular dispute had ended, whether he had perhaps wished it handled differently. His silence grew heavy, as though the air itself had thickened around him. The narrative arranged itself with a seductive tidiness, a rivalry from decades earlier, a manuscript disputed, reputations bruised. The dead man, returning after half a lifetime, seeking acknowledgement or vindication. Eldridge, confronted with the unresolved past, panicking when an old shame was about to be dredged up. A confrontation near the Meadow building. A fall perhaps accidental, perhaps not, and afterwards, the quiet rearranging of memory that academics perform with more skill than most professions permit. Lewis asked whether I was suggesting the death was the result of a long-buried quarrel. I told him it seemed more possible than possible at that moment. I confessed that the misquotation had struck me not as carelessness, but as a signal, a subconscious admission of guilt. Eldridge flinched then, the smallest recoil, enough to persuade me wrongly, as I would learn that I had found the fault line. He sank into a chair, his shoulders folding inward. He spoke, haltingly, of the past of a student he had mentored too harshly, of scholarly pride, of a mistaken judgment that had cost the young man an opportunity he had desperately wanted. It was not an admission of violence nor of fear, but it carried enough sorrow to mimic either. I mistook that sorrow for something darker. For a few minutes, the silence between us felt like confirmation. I thought I had reached the heart of the matter. I felt a grim satisfaction, sharpened by the sense that I had finally grasped the logic hidden behind all those fragments. It was Lewis's phone that shattered the illusion. A call from the hospital said Eldridge had been admitted the night before the body was found. Minor cardiac episode. He had been under observation until morning. There had been no midnight confrontation, no panicked shove, no fatal meeting in the meadow shadows. The false solution collapsed swiftly, leaving the stale taste of misplaced certainty. Eldridge's sorrow was not guilt. It was the familiar ache of a life spent in the company of regrets that had never asked for resolution. When we stepped back into the corridor, the air felt colder, the walls narrower, as though the college itself had pulled slightly away from me. Lewis asked if we had been wrong. I told him yes, though the admission lodged in my throat with stubborn reluctance. It is a dangerous thing to desire clarity too strongly. It turns shadows into shapes they never meant to hold. And somewhere behind us, in the hush of those ancient rooms, I felt the truth waiting patiently, untouched, indifferent to my mistake. There are moments in a case when the present loosens its grip, allowing something older, quieter, more insistent to rise through the cracks. That evening, as Lewis and I stepped into the dim corridor outside the college archive room, I felt such a shift, subtle as the turn of a key in a long, unused lock. The air had cooled, and the light from the courtyard filtered through the leaded windows in fractured strips, as though reluctant to illuminate what waited in the shadows. I remember thinking that the knock at Merton Tower, that single, solitary sound, had not belonged to the night alone. It had belonged to a memory. Lewis was speaking about forms, timetables, witness lists, the orderliness he trusted against the chaos he feared, but I heard little of it. My attention drifted instead to the old photograph I carried under my arm, a print the archivist had produced after an hour's rummaging through boxes marked with years smudged into illegibility. He had handed it to me with the vague curiosity of a man passing along an object whose significance he could not guess. I had not shown it to Lewis yet. Not out of secrecy. Only because its weight felt strangely personal, as though meant for my eyes before anyone else's. We returned to the quad. The evening mist lifted in thin curls around the lawn, the faint scent of wet stone rising with it. I stopped beneath the archway of the tower and unfolded the photograph. The glossy surface caught what remained of the light, revealing a group of scholars standing near the very place I now stood. Young men, wide-collared shirts, the fashions of a decade that had long since receded into gentler forms of embarrassment. In the center stood a figure whose face bore a startling, unmistakable resemblance to the man found by the Meadow building. A younger version, perhaps softer at the edges, eyes bright with the recklessness youth sometimes confuses with hope. Lewis leaned in, frowning. He asked if it was the same man. I told him I believed it was. But what startled me was not merely the resemblance. It was the presence of another figure beside him, someone half-turned, caught in mid-step, as though leaving the frame even as the shutter clicked. Her posture, though blurred, mirrored the woman I'd met in the cloister shadows. The same angled head, the same guarded composure. Time had altered her face, but not her silhouette, nor the way she held the weight of her silence. Lewis muttered something about coincidences. I said Oxford rarely deals in coincidences. It prefers recurrence. The dead man had not been a stranger wandering into a college he did not know. He had once belonged here, woven into the fabric of a story that had been stitched, unraveled, and left unfinished. A deduction stirred at the edges of my mind then, unwilling yet to show itself fully. I considered the knock at the tower a signal made not to a porter, not to strangers, but to someone who might remember its rhythm. A shared code, perhaps, something from a past neither entirely forgiven nor forgotten. A return not chosen but compelled. The archivist's notes had mentioned the photograph was taken at the end of a seminar series in 1974, the same year, on the library slip. I felt a faint tightening in my chest at the alignment of those details. Scholars love to speak of symmetry in art, as in literature, in architecture. But symmetry in life is often troubling. It suggests a circle one has failed to break. We walked along the cloister again, our footsteps mixing with the soft echo of the dripping gutter. I told Lewis what I suspected: the dead man had come back for something unfinished, something left in the archive's untidy boxes or in the locked rooms of memory. Lewis asked what that something might be. I admitted I didn't yet know, but I did know that the knock had not been a plea for entry, so much as a summons, a reminder sent to someone who had hoped the past would remain politely silent. We reached the far end of the cloister, where the shadows pooled more deeply. The faint sound of a door closing drifted toward us from an upper staircase, slow, deliberate, unmistakably cautious. Lewis looked up. I did not. I already knew who had closed it: the woman from the cloister, the woman from the photograph. And though the years between the two moments stretched wide, the echo of that old knock reverberated still unchanged, unsoftened, demanding once again to be answered. If there is one flaw I have never managed to excise from myself, it is the yearning for patterns, for the hopeful illusion that a set of scattered details might suddenly arrange themselves into something intelligible, like the completed grid of a crossword that had seemed impossible an hour before. That evening, as Lewis and I walked back toward the lodging house where the visiting researcher had been staying, I felt the familiar tightening of that desire. The photograph, the knock, the year 1974, the woman whose silences echoed more loudly than any confession, each piece pressed itself into a design that, for a fleeting moment, convinced me it could hold. The streets near the High were slick with fresh drizzle, their reflections fractured by the uneven stones. I remember the faint hum of bicycle tires somewhere in the distance, the smell of wet paper drifting from the open door of a bookshop closing for the night. Oxford never truly sleeps. It merely dims itself. And in that dimness, the mind is far too eager to fill the quiet with narrative. Lewis said the researcher's name again, half to himself, as though repeating it might conjure meaning from its syllables. He had been one of the few to interact with the dead man in recent days, a few brief exchanges in the library, a shared reading table, perhaps a remark about the manuscript. I seized on that connection with a hunger I barely recognized at the time. We found the man in his small, sparsely furnished room, surrounded by stacks of photocopied articles, their corners curling from damp. He looked at us with the weary alertness of someone accustomed to being misunderstood. I asked about the manuscript, about the photograph, about the year 1974. He answered each question with a disarming calm, though there was a faint one when I mentioned the woman in the cloister shadows. He said her name softly, with a kind of reverence, and insisted he had known her only through correspondence. But the way his eyes drifted toward the window after speaking told a slightly different story. Not deceit, just incompleteness. The theory I constructed, then the second false one, grew from that flicker. I imagined a triangulation of affection, a man returning after decades to confront a past love, another man currently entangled in some intellectual or emotional orbit around the same woman. A collision of sentiment and jealousy that had tipped into violence. It was a familiar pattern, one that literature often indulges and life occasionally echoes. I allowed it to harden too soon. I asked whether the researcher had met the dead man outside the Meadow building on the night in question. He inhaled sharply enough to be mistaken for guilt, but perhaps only surprise. He denied it, though his voice carried a brittle edge. Lewis watched him with a suspicion he rarely displayed so openly. For a moment, the air in the tiny room felt charged, as though truth hovered just above the surface of every syllable. But then the researcher mentioned something that cracked the theory cleanly in half. He said he had been in the Bodleian that night until closing, reading through letters from the 1970s that had only recently been made available. He offered the reference numbers without hesitation. His confidence was not arrogance, it was clarity. I recognized the tone. It was the sound of someone telling the truth reluctantly, not because the truth endangered him, but because it failed to satisfy the question being asked. Lewis checked the times. The alibi held inconveniently, stubbornly, and without the faintest room for interpretation. As we stepped back into the corridor, the floorboards groaned under our weight with a tiredness that seemed almost reproachful. I felt the familiar slump of a theory collapsing, the mental echo of a solution dismissed. The disappointment was sharper this time, perhaps because the narrative had been so seductive. Jealousy. Memory. A woman who seemed to carry half the past in her silence. It had all fitted too neatly. We walked in silence toward the stairwell. At the landing, Lewis stopped and asked whether I believed the researcher was entirely irrelevant. I told him no one in Oxford is entirely irrelevant. The place collects relevance the way dust collects on old books. But I admitted the theory was wrong. Outside, the mist had returned, drifting through the streetlights in slow ribbons. I stood for a moment, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the gutters, and felt the case shift again, the second false trail fading like breath on cold glass. The truth was still there, somewhere in the quiet, but it would not be reached by elegance or intuition alone. It would require a return to something smaller, something nearly overlooked, a knock, a slip of paper, a pause in a woman's breath. And I felt, reluctantly, that the investigation was not circling outward but inward, toward a point I had been trying, perhaps unconsciously, not to see too soon. It is a curious humiliation the moment one realizes that the thing sought so frantically in a web of manuscripts, alibis, and half-spoken stories had been waiting, quietly, in plain sight. That evening, as I returned to the porter's lodge with the rain settling into its familiar rhythm against the windows, I found myself retracing steps I should never have abandoned. There is a danger in intellect. It urges the mind toward complexity, even when simplicity stands patiently with its hand raised. The lodge smelled of damp wool and old ledgers, the sort of smell that settles permanently into the walls of a building built to endure centuries of hesitant confessions. The porter, the same man who had spoken of the midnight knock, looked up when I entered, his expression polite yet burdened by the fatigue of long days spent guarding other people's secrets. I asked him again to recount the sound he had heard that night. He did so willingly, though with a mild confusion, as though uncertain why the question deserved a second asking. He repeated the same pattern, a single knock, a pause, a silence. He had risen from his chair, he said, thinking some student had lost his key, but when he reached the gate, there was no one there. The story itself had not changed. What changed was the cadence of his telling, a faint hesitation before describing where he had been sitting, a slight adjustment to how quickly he had reached the door, a narrowing of detail rather than an expansion. It was then and only then that the deduction slipped into focus, the kind that arrives not with triumph, but with a quiet, chastening clarity. The porter had not been sitting in the chair he pointed to. He had been standing near the window, the shift in his phrasing, barely perceptible before, now pressed itself forward like an ink smudge beneath a lamp. He had been expecting something that night, or someone. I asked whether he had known the man from the Meadow building. He stiffened, though only slightly. He said he hadn't. His eyes moved to the ledger on the counter, then away again. People rarely lie with their voices. They lie with their glances. I told him gently that expecting a visitor is not a crime. He replied with a sort of non-answer that reveals more than it conceals. People from the old days sometimes return, sir. Not all of them want to be known. The phrase struck me sharply in the old days. I had heard it before, in the archives, whispering over the photograph. The year 1974 again rose like a half-forgotten refrain. The porter would have been young then, perhaps a trainee, perhaps someone who had known the scholars captured in that faded print. Perhaps he had watched them through the same window where he had claimed not to have stood. Lewis joined me a few minutes later. He glanced between us, sensing a shift, but uncertain of its source. I asked the porter whether the woman I had spoken to in the cloister shadows had been on college grounds that night. His answer came too quickly. "She used to walk here often, sir, but not recently." The contradiction embedded itself immediately, as she had been on the grounds the previous afternoon. Recently enough. Recently, indeed. Lewis raised an eyebrow, waiting for me to explain. I didn't. Some explanations, especially premature ones, have a way of strangling the truth before it fully forms. Instead, I asked the porter a final question. Did the knock sound familiar? A small, harmless query, delivered without accusation. He looked at me for a long moment, and in that moment the silence grew heavier than any answer he could have given. He finally said he couldn't be sure. But his voice had changed, softened, thinned, as though worn down by memory. I realized then that the knock had not been a stranger's. It had been recognized. And recognition is the kind of intimacy that lies very close to guilt. When we stepped back into the night, the air was cold enough to sting. Lewis asked what the porter had been hiding. I told him I didn't think he was hiding anything malicious, only that he had been protecting the shape of a story he believed no longer belonged to him. But the detail, the one everyone had missed, was simple. You do not react to a knock unless you have been listening for it. And someone, somewhere in the quiet years between 1974 and now, had given him reason to listen. There are certain sounds that refuse to fade, however many years intervene, however much living one attempts in the space between. The knock at Merton Tower had followed me through the case like a quiet shadow, patient and insistent. And on that final night, the night when the truth at last stepped out of hiding, I heard it again, not as memory but as echo, carried across the quad by the faintest tremor of wind. Lewis had gone to speak with the duty constable, leaving me alone beneath the archway where the lantern threw its pale halo against the stones. The air smelled of wet ivy and cooling mortar, the scents that cling to Oxford long after the rain has withdrawn. I took out the old photograph one last time, the one from 1974, and studied the faces. The dead man is younger, open and hopeful. The woman half-turned, protective of some inner frailty. And between them, barely visible, the porter, then a boy with a gaze fixed on something outside the frame. A triangle of unfinished stories. I thought of the porter's voice earlier, that thinning thread of guilt woven through his silence. He had not meant harm. Sometimes the past binds itself to those least equipped to carry it. The cloister behind me stirred as though the building inhaled. I turned to find her there, the woman from the shadows, her hair damp with mist, her posture held with a controlled dignity that made the air around her seem taut. She said my name softly, not as a plea but as surrender. She stepped closer, and I saw that she carried no paper tonight, no folded remnant of the life she had tried to bury. "He shouldn't have come back," she said. Her voice trembled, though not from fear, from memory, from loss that had steeped itself so deeply into her that even her pauses felt worn. I asked whether she had known he would return. She closed her eyes for a moment, and that was answer enough. She told me that the man by the Meadow building had once been more than a name on a library slip. He had been the one person who had understood her when she was young, when she was trying to survive in a college full of sharper minds and crueler ambitions. They had shared a secret then, one tied to the manuscript from the archives of a work they had crafted together, though only his name had appeared on the official version. When he left suddenly after a scandal quietly contained by the faculty, she had been left alone with the consequences. The missing page in the manuscript had been hers, a confession of authorship. of affection, of something too raw to endure scrutiny. She had torn it out, hiding herself not from him, but from the world that would not have forgiven her place in his life. And now he had returned, she said, her voice folding into itself. He had knocked at the tower not to accuse her, but to ask her to remember, to forgive him for leaving, to give shape to a past they had both abandoned too clumsily. I asked what had happened after the knock. She looked at the stones beneath her feet, and when she lifted her gaze again, it was clouded with something older than sorrow. "He found me near the meadow building," she said. He tried to explain, but he was shaking, and I panicked. I told him everything was too late, too altered, too distant. He reached for my arm, not violently, desperately. I pulled back. He slipped. The ground was wet. Her breath caught then, as though repeating the moment required more strength than living it. She knelt beside him, she said. She knew he was dying. He had called her by the name no one else used anymore. And then he went still. I asked why she hadn't come forward. She answered with a quietness that made the rain-soaked stones seem louder beneath our feet, because I knew no one would believe it wasn't anger, or jealousy, or retribution for the life that passed me by while he continued. She wasn't wrong. Oxford understands guilt better than accident. Lewis appeared at the edge of the cloister, his expression shadowed with the apprehension of someone who has walked into a story nearing its final page. I told him she was ready to speak. She nodded, though not in defeat, in acceptance. We walked together toward the lodge, the three of us crossing the quad as the mist thickened into something like a veil. When we reached the tower gate, she paused and touched the iron gently with her fingertips. "He always knocked like that," she whispered. "Once, never twice." And though the air was still, I felt that knock echo through the stones, not accusation, not plea, simply the last fragile attempt of a man trying to return to a life he had once abandoned too quickly. Some truths do not offer comfort. They offer only closure in its thinnest, most fragile form. But closure, even fragile, is sometimes all that remains to give.